There is a child rapist who has been walking free in Johnson County for many years now. You won't find his name on any registry because he's never been convicted. And you might ask yourself, why am I telling a story about someone who has never been convicted of a crime that I'm accusing him of? Well, the reason is because people deserve to know. They deserve to protect their children. There's plenty of evidence to back up what I'm about to say to you. The man that I'm talking about is Chad Melton. Chad Melton is a person who has several children with several different mothers. Not that I care about that. I don't really. But he only has one child with each mother. The first child, let's call her M, is an adult now. Chad was not married to M's mother, and he's never really had any sort of a major role in her life, although he has seen her on rare occasions. Now, while I have heard that Chad Melton has other children in Kansas and possibly even in the Johnson County area, the next child that is for sure his is named S. Now, he was married to S's mother for a period of time. Chad didn't have much of a relationship with S for her younger years because when S was less than 2 years old, Chad and S's mother separated. Now, Chad did try to keep S from her mother, but the mother was able to get S back and leave Chad successfully. She relocated to a different part of the state, a different county, to stay away from Chad. After that first marriage ended, Chad went on to marry another person, but he didn't have any children with her. So I'm going to leave that one alone. I'm not going to mention that person's name. I will say that during the course of that relationship, Chad would do things like steal that person's children's puppies and hold them away from her in order to get what he wanted. Who steals a kid's puppy? Not a reasonable person anyway. After the divorce of that second marriage, Chad connected with a woman I'll call Kay. Kay had 2 children from a previous marriage, and she and Chad got together and quickly decided to have their own child. They did have a daughter. Now, Kay and Chad lived together in Clarksville. Chad would do things like not provide for his daughter. He wouldn't buy food for the family. He wouldn't buy clothing for his daughter, even though they were living in the same home. Chad did what he wanted to do, and he was very much so financially abusive in that way. And that is a form of intimate partner violence. During the course of that relationship, Chad was also arrested for hitting Kay. There were accusations that were levied at that time, like Kay's older daughter telling her father that Chad came and looked at her in the shower while she was showering. Now, those are accusations that Kay flat out denied. Now, Kay and Chad did eventually break up. Now, when they broke up, Kay moved to a different county and lived in an apartment. She lived in that apartment for a little while, but she and Chad started communicating once again. Kay had, of course, custody because Chad and she hadn't been married. There wasn't a custodial agreement in place. Kay had custody, per the state of Arkansas, of their daughter, H, who was under the age of 2. Kay and Chad had discussed getting back together, and one night in April 2016, Chad came to Kay's apartment. He poured drinks for her. Kay called family members the next morning saying that she couldn't remember that night. It was very strange to her. She was panicked. She didn't know what had happened, where the time had gone. She was taken to the hospital per her request. And at the hospital, a drug test was done, and it was found that Kristen had methamphetamine in her system. Kristen wasn't a known drug user and insisted that Chad had drugged her by giving her these drinks that he poured himself. The day that Kristen was drugged was April 8th, 2016. Kristen didn't know at that time, but that same day, before Chad went to Kristen's home and poured those drinks for her, Chad went and hired an attorney and had that attorney file emergency papers to get custody of their daughter pending a drug test. At that point, Kristen relocated to a women's shelter because she felt that she wasn't safe and didn't have another place to go. She was afraid that Chad was trying to unalive her. She still didn't know about the emergency custody paperwork that was done for Chad to have custody of H. But when she did find out, she did avoid doing the drug test, not because she was a drug user, but because she knew that he had drugged her and was afraid of losing her daughter. And when she did do the drug test, she passed the drug test. But because Kay avoided being served and because she didn't have an apartment, because she gave it up to go to that women's shelter, and also she had just recently lost her job. Now, the reason that I told you all of that is because that is the links that Chad went to get H into his possession. And I think that that's an important thing to note. In order to try to get her daughter back into her custody, Kay started recording all of her phone calls. And because Kay was recording all of her phone calls, she recorded a phone call that I would call pivotal. Now, this phone call that she recorded, she didn't mean to record it. It was just one that she recorded because she was recording all of her calls. She would just record them and go and delete them according to her. But she recorded a phone call where one of Chad's family members called her and told her that another family member, a younger family member of theirs, came to her and told that family member that Chad had molested that family member when she was 13 years old, 12 to 13 years old.
They were up there, for a holiday. And Chad and had to sleep in the bed together. And looked up and Chad's fingers were... What? Yeah.
Now, I'm not sure why, but the victim in that instance did not want anyone to know what had happened or who she was. She didn't want anyone coming forward. And the only reason she ever even mentioned it was because she was worried about H's safety. She was worried about H's safety because immediately after Chad got custody of H, Chad married another woman. This was his third marriage. Now, he didn't have a child with this woman whose name is C, but he did have her basically raise H for him. During the time that C was taking care of H, because H was very small, H had terrible yeast infections, green yeast infections that were so bad. And Chad refused to let Kay take H to the doctor, but he said that he had taken H to the doctor and that they were treating H with the medication that the doctor had given her. He also, terribly gaslit Kay by telling her that H only had these bad yeast infections whenever Kay had H in her possession for a weekend visit. Which, according to Kay, and she knew that that wasn't true because she knew that when she got H had these terrible yeast or whatever it was issues, and she would try to solve them herself. But like I said, Chad would not allow her the information to take H to the doctor. And Kay also had an attorney that advised her not to say anything about it in court because with the judge that they had at that time, the judge would say that Kay was making up stuff. So Kay couldn't tell what was going on with H, and she also couldn't say anything about the relative, the minor relative that came forward saying that she had been essayed by Chad. A month after Chad got custody of H, S's mom was arrested for a non-drug related misdemeanor. Chad filed papers saying that S was in danger because that mother was arrested for drugs. That wasn't true, but that's what the attorney claimed. And Chad was given emergency custody of S, a child that he hadn't seen in 6 to 8 years. A child who didn't even know who Chad was. Now, I have had the opportunity to speak to this victim myself, S, and what I can tell you is that S did not want to be in Chad's home at all. Chad tried to be nice to S at first, but S was not receptive because, like I said, she was basically thrown into this home. So when she was not receptive to Chad's quote unquote kindness, Chad became very abusive to S. And by being abusive to S, I mean that he basically made her Cinderella. He made her do all of the cleaning. She couldn't have friends over. She couldn't go do extra things. She didn't get to have birthday parties. She got to have nothing. She was basically cut off from the world, along with Chad's third wife telling S all the time that her mom wasn't doing what she should be doing to get to see S. That wife, C, told S, an 8 to 10-year-old child, that her mother didn't love her. Chad was very physically abusive to S, and DHS was called to their home several times, but each time the cases were dismissed. It wasn't long before Chad started graping S. In addition to graping S, Chad also told everyone around him, anyone that would listen, that S was a liar, He did that from right after the time that she arrived. So when S told people that Chad had done something to her, no one would believe her. S probably wasn't honest about things like, was her homework done? Did she do all of her chores? But in reality, if I was going to get beat, I would probably have lied too. That's just the child's logic. Now, at the same time, all of that was going on, Chad shared custody of H with K. They had a joint custody agreement. Chad was the custodial parent, but K had H for half the time as well. Really, K was supposed to have H for half the time. The thing was that Chad would withhold visitation from K unless K had sex with Chad. So many times K would have to meet Chad in the middle of the week to have intercourse with him so that he would allow her to have the visitation with her daughter that was court ordered. That's called grape. And Chad's wife, C, knew that all of that was going on, and she just sat there and didn't say a word. At least not to anyone that mattered. At some point, C and Chad separated. C filed for an order of protection, and then they got divorced. And Chad went on to impregnate one woman and marry another, and then impregnate her, having 2 more children in close succession. At the end of April 2021, I got a call from DHS that Chad had been graping S and that S and H had both been removed from Chad's custody. When this happened, Chad told the court that he didn't want to see S. He didn't want to see her, but he wanted to see H. Chad would see H for visitations. There was a discrepancy between the way that Chad treated H and the way that Chad treated S. Chad made S do all of the chores and stuff in the household. Chad bought H all of the gifts. A lot of people referred to that as grooming. DHS referred to that as grooming. Counselors referred to that as grooming. And the investigator referred to that as grooming. Chad continued to do what they referred to as grooming through his visitations with H that were supervised by DHS. He would bring her bags of gifts at these visitations once a week. As the investigation loomed on, Chad had not only a criminal case, but he had a DHS case to deal with. Eventually, the SA and grape accusations against Chad were substantiated in DHS court. So that left only the criminal charges to deal with. Because of the substantiation in DHS court, H was returned to her mother and S was eventually returned to her mother. Now, it's important to note that even in DHS court, Chad was asked if any drug tests should be done on any of the parents, and he replied no. No drug test was ever done on K after that initial drug test where he got custody of H. And several years, like 6, 8 years had gone by at that time. In my opinion, that demonstrates that Chad knew that K wasn't a drug user. He never feared of her being a drug user. He only drugged her in order to get custody of H. And then after that, it wasn't an issue because she was not the one that was using drugs. Through the course of the investigation, the relative came forward as a victim of Chad, that minor relative who was now an adult. Also, S came forward as a victim of Chad. 2 more people, 2 more children came forward as victims of Chad. At this point, he was now divorced from Chad and his daughter came forward as a victim. Stated in text messages even before her daughter came forward as a victim that she was concerned that her daughter was a victim because Chad basically skeeved her daughter out. Chad was obsessed over her daughter when her daughter was like 16 years old. He was jealous over her daughter. He got jealous when her daughter got a vehicle because then she could go where she wanted. He got very jealous when this 16-year-old little girl got a boyfriend, to the point that that child requested to go live with her father so that she didn't have to be around Chad again. A 4th unnamed victim also came forward. It wasn't anything that could be charged criminally because they were consenting adults, but there was also a multitude of stories that came out about Chad having intercourse with his cousins, close cousins, several of them. Criminal court loomed on for a while before one of the victims changed her story. It was the daughter of who changed her story. She said that she was not a victim, that she was forced to lie about being a victim, and completely recanted. Now, it's interesting that this happened while was starting to spend time with Chad again. It's also interesting to me that this child, who is now an adult, has allegedly told other people that she is a victim of Chad and that she never said that she wasn't a victim of Chad. At that point, the prosecutor decided that those 3 victims that had already came forward weren't enough to carry forth the case, and the charges against Chad Melton were dropped. Imagine being one of those 3 victims that still remained and being told that your story doesn't matter. It's not enough to charge this person with rape of a child. It's not enough to protect other children. Well, it's neither here nor there, because at least Chad is away from children at this point, correct? Wrong. As soon as the criminal charges were dismissed, Chad started telling people that S was the person that recanted, that they knew that S was lying all along and they were able to prove it, so the state had to drop the case. As soon as the charges were dismissed, Chad started telling people that S was the one that recanted. That's not true. S never recanted. Another victim is the one that recanted, but he wasn't even charged with that victim's case. It seems that the state intended to use all the other victims' cases, all the other victims' experiences with Chad Melton to strengthen S's case so that Chad could be put away when it came to S's case. But when one of them recanted, then it made it more difficult to strengthen S's case. And the prosecution decided to dismiss the case. But Chad started lying, telling people that S had recanted. And also, Chad told people that a note was found in his home after S was removed from the home, that it was a note that was penned by S. And it said, "I'm sorry, Dad." And that the reason it said, "I'm sorry, Dad," was because that S was lying and she was sorry for lying about the accusations. Now, that doesn't make any sense at all. It's more likely that she was made to write that she's sorry in order to get out of trouble for something. And then he used that to tell other people, "Look what she wrote. She wrote that because she knows that she's lying about the accusations." But you'll remember, and I want this to stick with people, no one knew about that first relative of Chad's except for a small handful of people. Other people didn't know about that relative, that Chad had SA'd that relative. S did not know that Chad had SA'd that relative. She had no way of knowing. So there was one relative that came forward, then S came forward. And what are the chances that he SA'd that relative, but then S just made up this story about similar things? I don't think that there is a chance. Chad has demonstrated that he doesn't have a moral compass when it comes to having sexual relations with anyone and everyone around him, regardless of their age or their relationship to him. Stories have flooded out about the cousins. Stories flooded out about how Chad gave his brother's wife chlamydia. There have been tons of stories that have came out about Chad and him having intercourse with somebody at some point in time that he shouldn't have been involved with at all. Most importantly, children, where he always finds a way to be around children. Even while the case of rape was pending, Chad was going to things like children's rodeos and children's ball fields and being around children. Anybody who knows about Chad Melton and who knows what he has done to these children hopes that he's away from children. But Chad isn't away from children, because when the charges were dropped, within 2 months of the charges being dropped, Kay signed over custody of H back to Chad. At this point, the school district that H is going to, H is heavily involved in sports. She is involved in cheerleading, and Chad is there for all of it. Chad also does things like attend high school parties. Isn't that a little weird for a 40-something-year-old man to be going to high school parties? Unless you consider the fact that that 40-something-year-old man prefers his girls to be very young. It seems like pretty quickly after the end of that criminal case, after those charges were dismissed, it came out that Chad had been abusive to his wife at that time, his newest wife, the one that he had his youngest child with. Now, according to that wife, Chad hit her. Chad choked her. Chad ended up attacking that wife at a school bus stop in front of the children. Chad was arrested for domestic violence in that incident. And when Chad was arrested, his estranged wife had to get an order from the court to force Chad to tell her where her young child was, because Chad had been holding that young child from her for several days. which, if you'll remember, is kind of a lot like what that first wife said Chad had done. Chad did eventually take a plea deal in that case where he got a suspended sentence. Some people believe that even though Chad may have raped S, that he wouldn't rape H, who is the child that is in his custody now, because he likes H, but he didn't like S. He treated S poorly, but he treats H so well. But the thing is that people close to Kristen say that he may have already done something to H, because just around the time that the rape accusations came out when it came to S, and that S and H were both removed from Chad's custody back in 2021, Kay allegedly told some people close to her that Chad had already done something to H, that he SA'd H while he was giving her a shower. Of course, over time, Chad has been able to convince some people that this was merely an accident. At this point in time, Chad Melton is free, and he will remain free until other victims come forward and the prosecution decides to take the crimes of Chad Melton seriously and tell these victims once and for all that they do matter.